Hello everyone, this is part 2 of chapter 6, Learning. So we are continuing with the principles and principles 2 and 3, which are stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Now, stimulus generalization is going to happen when there's an event that's going to be kind of similar to the original conditioned stimulus that triggers the same type of conditioned response. The more the stimulus resembles that conditioned stimulus, that stronger the conditioned response is going to be. So, for an example, after first conditioning dogs to be able to salivate at the sound of that tone, Pavlov, he kind of was able to later show that dogs would also salivate in response to higher pitched tones. And similarly, after the conditioning, like when we talked about little Albert with Watson and Rayner's experiment, the fear was not only with the rats, but also the rabbit, a dog, uh, even the bearded Santa Claus mask. So eventually, though, through a process of stimulus discrimination, and that's going to be, what's referring to a learned response to a specific stimulus, but it's not, to other similar stimuli. Little Albert, he presumably was able to learn to recognize the differences between the rats as well as other stimuli or animals. So as a result, he probably was able to overcome his fear of Santa Claus, even if he remained afraid of the white rats. Now, when we're talking about principles 4 and 5, we're now talking about extinction, and that's the gradual disappearance of a conditioned response. And that occurs when an unconditioned stimulus is withheld whenever the conditioned stimulus is going to be presented. So Pavlov, of course, he repeatedly sounded the tone without presenting food. The dog's salivation, it started to actually decline. Similarly, if you kind of look at classical conditioned fear of cats and then later start to work as a vet, your fear will gradually diminish due to a lot of exposure. However, extinction is not unlearning, okay? It's not that it's being erased. That learned connection between the stimulus and the response. Matter of fact, what it is on occasion an extinguished response may spontaneously reappear. Okay? This is what we call spontaneous recovery. It kind of helps us to be able to explain why you might suddenly feel excited at the sight of a former girlfriend or boyfriend, even though it's been years since you've seen them, or extinction had occurred. It also kind of helps to explain why couples who recently broke up sometimes would misinterpret a sudden flare-up of feelings and a return to unhappy relationships. Even still, if a conditioned stimulus is reintroduced after extinction, the conditioning occurs even faster the second time around, and that phenomenon is known as being reconditioned. Principle number 6, speaking about that higher order conditioning. Here, children are not born salivating upon seeing the McDonald's golden arches. So why do they beg their parents to stop at Mickey D's after simply seeing that's magic sign? Well, it's because of higher order conditioning, which again, it occurs with a neutral stimulus and it becomes a conditioned stimulus. Through that repeated parents, every time you see it, every time you see the arch and you go and you have your Happy Meal, you start to equate the Happy Meal with the arch, okay? And that's through that repeated parents with a previously conditioned stimulus. So if you wanted to be able to demonstrate higher order conditioning, like when we're talking about Pavlov's dogs, then you would first condition the dogs to salivate in response to the sound of the tone. Same would hold true with children. First, you would pair the McDonald's restaurants with that Happy Meal. Now, when you pair a flashlight with the tone, the dogs will start to recognize that flashlight as well as the tone. Same can hold true that later on children would associate the arch, the sign of the McDonald's restaurant with the Happy Meal. Eventually, dogs will salivate in response to the flash of light alone, and the same thing as in regards to kids. Kids are going to begin to want to eat at that restaurant when they see the arches. They see the arches, they think Happy Meal, they think food, yay! Alright, so I try to make it sound exciting, but hopefully you got a clear understanding about it. Now, in terms of when we're talking about how to be able to relate classical conditioning to our everyday lives, this slide gives a really strong picture of stuff that we're dealing with today. Okay, in this picture you see a child that's holding a KKK sign. Now, how did this child that's holding this KKK sign develop prejudice at such an early age? If you're looking at the diagram here on the slide, you can kind of see that as the children are naturally going to be upset and fearful when they see parents upset. So over time, what's happening is they start to learn to become upset and fearful, which is the conditioned response. If they start seeing their parents respond negatively, and that negative response for the parents is called the unconditioned stimulus. And that's when they are upset or being negative toward any member of a group that they dislike. And that dislike group would be considered the conditioned stimulus. Okay? Now, classical conditioning continued this horrific picture, and for me, this is a big phobia. I have a huge phobia over roaches, cockroaches. They're disgusting, they're nasty. I see it, I run. Okay, but it's just looking at this kind of phobia. It sets off fears, irrational fears. Because I mean, I'm bigger than the roach, right? I can step on it, but I don't even want to do that. I hate the squish sound. Okay, and so we've learned to associate that neutral stimulus, which is the cockroach, with unconditioned stimulus. And for me, it's been the squish, it's been the feel, just all of that. That's the unconditioned stimulus for me. But in this example, it's talking about how a child might have heard a parent scream at the sight of it. So my kids might have wound up growing up being afraid of cockroaches because they might have heard me scream. And that's going to happen until the conditioned response, which would be that fear of the sight, has finally become conditioned. Now, examples of classical conditioning is found even within the medical field. So, for one example, a treatment designed for alcohol addicted patients usually is pairing alcohol with a nauseous producing type drug. So what'll happen is afterwards, just being able to smell or even taste alcohol might make that person sick. Then there's some patients that have found that this treatment that is actually can be helpful, and then some's like not at all. Now, let's move on to talking about operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning is going to be based on what after we voluntarily perform a behavior. So what happens is we might do something, and because of it, we'll learn from those consequences. So operant conditioning is learning through voluntary responses and its consequences of it. And what happens is it's a reinforcement that would help to increase the behavior tendencies, whereas a punishment of that would decrease them. Reinforcement is the consequence that would help to strengthen and make it more likely that the behavior will happen. Punishment, again, is going to help to weaken a response, which hopefully will make it less likely to occur again. Now, Skinner, he kind of cautioned that the only way to know how we will be influenced by someone's behavior is to be able to check whether it increases or decreases. Sometimes he discussed that we think we're reinforcing or punishing when actually we're doing the opposite. So one example might be that, say, I might think that I'm encouraging students who are shy to talk by repeatedly praising them each time they speak up in class. But what if a shy student is embarrassed by the situation? Well, I might be thinking that I'm helping to increase the behavior, but me constantly, repeatedly asking them to speak might actually be a form of punishment for them. Therefore, it'll decrease in them being able to participate more. It is important for me to say, though, that what is reinforcing or punishing for one person might not be for the other. Okay. Now, Thorndike, he believed in what we call law of effect, and this is when the probability of an action being repeated is going to be strengthened when it's followed by something pleasant or satisfying. So think about every time you do a good job when you were growing up. If you did an assignment or you completed your chores, and your parents, they reinforced it by giving you $1 or saying great job, that means you want to do it again. That's what law and effect is talking about. It's all about those consequences. Now, in Thorndike's famous experiment, what he did was he put a cat inside a specialized built-in puzzle box, where the cat steps on a pedal inside the box. Excuse me, and that's going to happen actually through trial and error. The door will open, and then the cat would get out so he could eat. With each additional success that the cat has, the actions that the cat have becomes even more purposeful, and it'll soon learn to open that door immediately all on its own so it can get that food. Okay. Now let's look at how reinforcement strengthens and increases behavior. So primary reinforcer stimuli, that'll increase the probability of a response because it satisfies an intrinsic or innate unlearned biological need. That can be food, water, sex. Secondary type of reinforcers, that's those stimuli that's going to help increase the probability of a response simply because of their their learned value. And learned value meaning, like I mentioned before, you've gotten $1 or when you was a kid, or money, praise, getting special attention. Then there's what we say is positive reinforcement adding, and that's adding or rather presenting a stimulus which would strengthen a response, making it more likely to occur. That negative reinforcement is going to be taking away or removing a stimulus, which would strengthen a response and making it more likely to reoccur. So when you're hearing about positive or negative, don't automatically think about math in terms of subtract and add. You want to think about increasing and decreasing in terms of behaviors. And hopefully that'll help you to realize the difference between the two. Now, when we're talking about schedules of reinforcement, we're referring to that rate or the interval at which those responses are being reinforced. So although there are numerous schedules of reinforcements, the most important distinction is to know whether or not they're continuous or whether they're partial. So when Skinner was training his animals, what he did was he found that learning was more quickly if the response was reinforced every time it happened. And that procedure is called continuous reinforcement. Okay. As you might have noticed, in real life, there's seldom times when there's continuous reinforcement. So your behavior, it persists because your efforts are occasionally going to be rewarded. And most everyday behavior is going to be rewarded more on a partial, or what we say is an intermittent type of schedule. And that involves reinforcing on some responses, but not everything. The best type of example that you think of is if you do any gambling, the slot machine. And what happens is you'll play and you might hit on that first one, but as you continue to play, there's the intervals are staggered. They're not at the exact same time. You might hit on the third go, or it might take another 10 times before you hit again. That's what we're talking about, partial reinforcement. And believe it or not, this is one of the strongest in terms of reinforcement. So this guide here, this slide, is going to help you in terms of looking at the 4 schedules of partial reinforcement. One task is going to be well learned. It's important to be able to move to a partial schedule of reinforcement. And again, that's because under partial schedules, the behavior is going to be more resistant to extinction because you're anticipating and waiting and looking forward to. Therefore, it's not something that might immediately stop. There are 4 different schedules that we're talking about, and that being fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Okay, when we're talking about fixed ratios, we're looking at it where the reinforcement is going to happen at a predetermined number of times. So we're looking, if we want to say we're doing it 5 times, that's it. It's 5. It won't change to 6 or 4. It's always going to be 5. Variable ratio will occur at various type responses, whereas it might be first at every 3, and then it might be every 9, then it might be every 5, then it might be every 8. You see what I'm saying as far as variable. Fixed intervals are going to be speaking specifically at fixed different times. So we might say the reinforcement is going to happen all the time at 3 p.m. Think about when you're getting out of school and that makes you feel good. Well, every day at 3 o'clock is when you get out of school. That's a fixed interval. Okay. With variable intervals, it can happen at different times. You might get a treat today at 2 p.m., but then tomorrow I might put it at 1 p.m. So it's at intervals rather than specific fixed times. But here's a question. How could you teach someone to play the piano or be able to speak a foreign language? There are new and complex behaviors like these, which they're not likely to occur naturally. Then what Skinner felt is that shaping would be the valuable tool to use. His belief is that shaping explains a variety of abilities that each of us would possess. That being from being able to eat with a fork to playing the flute or the trombone to being able to drive a stick shift compared to an automatic. Okay, that all would happen based on shaping. And shaping is basically reinforcement through a series of successful or successively improved steps that would help to lead to the desired response. Now, let's look at punishment. And remember, punishment is not per se. Punishment, we look at decreasing a particular behavior, but it doesn't always have to come through corporal punishment. There's other forms. So when we're talking about positive punishment, that's where the addition of a stimulus that would help to decrease or weaken the likelihood of that response from happening again. Negative punishment is taking away the reinforcing stimulus, which would hopefully decrease or weaken the likelihood that a response will occur again. So looking at the slide, it's giving some examples of the positive punishment, okay? Like you have to run 4 extra laps in your gym because you were late, which discourages you from being late in the future, okay? Whereas if we looked at the negative punishment, which is taking a stimulus away, you're excluded from your gym class because you were late, which discourages you from being late in the future. Does it make sense? Well, here's one that I would say to help people out. What I tend to use for face-to-face class time is negative punishment, in that I take away class time from a student if they come in at 15 of the hour. Okay, if they come in anytime before that, they're allowed to come in, but I dock them. That's a positive punishment. Whereas a negative punishment is I don't allow them in the class at all. All right, this is going to end part 2 of chapter 6. We will pick up again when we're going to look at everyday life situations with operant conditioning.